Some truths don't shout, they wait. Arnold Schwarzenegger had spent decades staying above political mudslinging, but on a rainy night in Washington, D.C., one word from an 18-year-old Trump shattered the silence: unfit. That word didn't draw blood, it challenged a lifetime. And what followed wasn't rage, it was revelation. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if you believe character still matters in politics, hit that subscribe button. Some truths don't shout, they wait. Arnold Schwarzenegger had spent decades staying above political mudslinging, but on a rainy night in Washington, D.C., one word from an 18-year-old Trump shattered the silence: unfit. That word didn't draw blood, it challenged a lifetime. And what followed wasn't rage, it was revelation. The Georgetown University debate hall buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another campus event. This was a moment students would one day claim they witnessed firsthand. On one side sat Barron Trump, tall, composed, every inch the political heir people expected him to be. At just 18, he carried the last name like armor, towering over the audience with the kind of cold confidence that drew both admiration and fear. He wasn't just a student, he was a legacy in motion. Across from him sat someone few expected to appear in such a setting: Arnold Schwarzenegger. At 77, the former governor, action star, and immigrant icon didn't look out of place. In fact, he looked exactly like what he was: someone who'd fought too many battles to be intimidated by a lecture hall or a famous last name. His face was worn but focused. The lines in his skin weren't weakness, they were testimony. His silence, even before a single question was asked, was louder than applause. This wasn't just a generational clash, it was something deeper. Students murmured in the background. Phones were out. Social media was ready. C-SPAN cameras zoomed in as the moderator introduced the topic: how to engage Generation Z in the political process. It sounded harmless on paper, but everyone in that room felt the tension, like dry timber waiting for a spark. Barron spoke first, thanking the university and cracking a practiced smile. His voice was clean, rehearsed, with that unmistakable tone of someone who knew exactly how to own a room. He praised youth activism, the Constitution, the need for strong leaders. Then, with a shift in tone so slight you might miss it, he pivoted. "I think the real question," he said, "is whether public figures from the past can still guide us today, or whether they're simply holding the microphone because they refuse to pass it." The sentence was wrapped in civility but sharpened like a blade. His eyes didn't leave Arnold's. The message was clear. Arnold didn't flinch. He sat still, elbows on the table, fingers interlocked. It wasn't passive, it was deliberate, like a man who knew what was coming. Barron continued, "We've invited someone today who made his name in another era, through movies, through politics, through stories of struggle. And while I respect that history, I have to ask, does that qualify someone to advise the next generation on democracy, governance, and truth?" Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward. Others glanced at their phones, already preparing their first tweets. This was the Barron they'd heard about: articulate, ruthless, fearless, but something about Arnold's presence unsettled the room. He hadn't said a word, yet somehow the silence bent around him, not as submission, but as gravity. To some, it was strange to see him here at all. After all, Arnold had long stayed clear of direct political confrontation in his post-governor years. He focused on charity, on environmental policy, on mentoring youth. He rarely responded to insults. He never sought the spotlight unless it served a cause. So why now? That question lingered in the air, unanswered, even as the moderator turned toward him and invited a response. Arnold leaned slightly forward, but he didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he gave Barron a long, unblinking look. A look not of challenge, but of calculation, and maybe, just maybe, of disappointment. The kind of look a man gives when he sees a young version of himself on a darker path. No one in that room could have known what was coming next. But by the end of that night, they wouldn't remember Barron's attack. They would remember Arnold's answer, and it wouldn't come in the form of a speech. It would come in the form of something far more dangerous: the truth. The silence didn't last long. As soon as the moderator nodded for Barron to continue, he leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table like a man about to deliver a lesson, not a debate. His smile was calm, almost friendly, but the sharp edge in his voice betrayed the strategy behind it. "You know," Barron began, "when I was growing up, I heard a lot about Mr. Schwarzenegger, the movies, the muscles, the accent, the action one-liners. It was all very Hollywood." Laughter rippled through the audience, just enough to be audible. Barron paused, letting it land, his expression unchanged. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Hollywood doesn't make leaders. It makes characters. And Mr. Schwarzenegger, with all due respect, is just that, a character who stumbled into office during a moment of chaos. Not because of vision, not because of policy, but because people were desperate for a spectacle." The room tensed. Phones were out again. Students glanced at each other, unsure whether to cringe or cheer. It wasn't just bold, it was personal, a direct jab, and it was only beginning. Barron adjusted his blazer, eyes locked on Arnold. "We're here to talk about engaging Gen Z in politics, about truth, integrity, courage, but how do we take lessons on civic engagement from someone who once made a career of saying, 'I'll be back,' while holding a rocket launcher? At what point do we separate cinematic heroism from real-life leadership?" Another pause, controlled, calculated. "I mean, what is Mr. Schwarzenegger really offering us tonight? Nostalgia, muscles. A few clever lines about self-discipline and adversity." He looked to the crowd, drawing them in. "Because if that's all it takes, maybe we should be inviting The Rock next." This time the laughter was louder, nervous, divided. Some students smiled with discomfort. Others looked toward Arnold, waiting for a reaction, but he gave them nothing. He sat still, jaw slightly clenched, but his eyes unmoving, unflinching, not because the words didn't sting, but because he'd heard worse, much worse. Barron, sensing the opening, kept going. "The truth is, I think we have to be honest about what qualifies someone to shape the political minds of the next generation. Public service isn't a second act in a movie career. It's not a cameo on a debate stage. It's policy, it's philosophy, it's values grounded in more than just personal transformation and gym stories." He leaned back now, letting his words breathe. "Mr. Schwarzenegger's story may be inspiring, sure, the immigrant dream, the rise to power, the redemption arc, we've all seen the headlines. But personal hardship doesn't equal public qualification." The moderator, visibly uneasy, glanced at Arnold, then back at Barron. But the young Trump wasn't finished. He glanced down at his notes, then back up, delivering the next line with deliberate force. "Let's not pretend that being a movie star who happened to become governor gives you lifelong moral authority. Leadership isn't about overcoming odds in a screenplay. It's about standing firm in policy in the face of compromise, scandal, and scrutiny. And frankly, Mr. Schwarzenegger, I'm not sure your record holds up." The room was silent now, not from boredom, but from the kind of discomfort that comes when an unspoken line has been crossed. Some students looked to the moderator, half expecting a timeout, but none came. It was, after all, a debate. Barron's voice softened, as if to show restraint, but everyone knew it was only to drive the point deeper. "You're a symbol, sir, I get that. People admire your journey, I even admire parts of it, but the truth is symbols fade. They get replaced, they stop evolving, and when that happens, they don't lead anymore, they just stand in the way." For the first time, Arnold moved, not much, just a tilt of the head. His eyes met Barron's directly, not with anger, but with clarity, like a man who had seen storms and recognized that this carefully constructed performance, was nothing more than wind and noise. The moderator cleared her throat, finally interjecting. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, would you like to respond?" Arnold didn't move right away. He looked out into the crowd, scanning rows of young faces, most of them watching with wide eyes and bated breath. Then he turned back to Barron. "You've said a lot," he said quietly, voice gravel-thick and calm, "but let me tell you something. I didn't come here to talk about rocket launchers. I came here to talk about something you haven't learned yet." He paused. "Reality." And just like that, the mood shifted. The crowd sat straighter. The cameras zoomed in. because they sensed it too. Something was changing, and it was only the beginning. Arnold didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or wave his hands. He just looked at Barron for a moment longer, then let his eyes drift back to the moderator, then to the students. The room was still. Every phone was recording now, every breath held. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his accent thicker than usual, not because of emotion, but because he wanted it that way, because he wasn't reciting a campaign speech. He was remembering something real. "I was 15 years old when I saw a photo of Reg Park," Arnold said slowly. "Mr. Universe, strong, powerful, playing Hercules in a movie. I cut it out of a magazine and taped it to the wall above the only bed in the house. It wasn't my bed, it was my brother's. We shared it. A stiff mattress in a cold room in a village in Austria. No hot water, no heat, just silence and rules." His voice was even, not theatrical, just true. "My father was the chief of police. He believed in discipline. He believed in order. He also believed in something darker. He had worn the uniform of the wrong side during the war, and he brought that discipline into the house, with his hands, with his belt, with his silence." The audience was frozen. This wasn't the version of Arnold they were used to. This was Mr. Olympia. This wasn't the Terminator. This was the boy behind the myth. "I started lifting weights with broomsticks and stones. There was no gym, so I made one, because I believed that strength wasn't something you were given. It was something you built. One rep, 1 hour, one promise to yourself at a time." He looked directly at Barron again, calm but unyielding. "When I was 18, your age, I left Austria with $20 in my pocket. I didn't speak English. I didn't know anyone in America, but I came anyway." There was a long pause. A few students shifted in their seats, but most didn't move. "I worked construction during the day and studied English at night. I kept a dictionary in my back pocket and learned words one by one. Every nail I hammered, every concrete bag I lifted, I told myself it was getting me closer, not to fame, but to freedom." He let that sink in before continuing. "People laughed at me, my accent, my name, my body. They said I'd never make it, that I was too foreign, too big, too dumb, too different." Another pause, longer this time. "I didn't fight back with words. I didn't write angry tweets. I didn't throw insults across a debate table. I kept going. I trained, I worked, I read, I listened. I stayed quiet longer than I wanted, because sometimes silence is the hardest discipline." A few heads in the audience nodded now. The tone in the room had shifted. The contrast was becoming visible, even to those who had come only to support Barron. Arnold turned slightly toward the moderator, then back to the students. "When I finally got to Hollywood, they told me I'd never get a lead role. That my accent was too thick, my name too long, my body too strange. But I made them see me, not through volume, not through branding, but through presence, through work." He let that sit in the air, then brought it back to the moment. "When I became governor, people said I wasn't qualified. They said I was just a movie star. But I balanced a $26 billion deficit, passed environmental reform, created after-school programs for hundreds of thousands of children. Not because I had the answers, but because I surrounded myself with people who did, and I listened." Then finally, he returned to Barron. "So when you ask what qualifies someone to lead, maybe don't start with how many bills they've written. Maybe start with how many times they've had to rebuild themselves. Maybe start with how many times they were told no and kept going anyway." His eyes held firm, because leadership doesn't start with power, it starts with pain, and what you choose to do with it. There was no applause, not yet. Just a weight in the air, a kind of gravity that didn't come from volume, but from truth. Barron shifted slightly in his chair, his smile thinner now, his notes sat untouched. And for the first time since the debate began, he looked like someone who might not have prepared for what was coming next. For a moment, it seemed like Barron might stay quiet. The kind of silence that comes not from humility, but calculation. His eyes darted briefly across the room, gauging the crowd. Some students were visibly moved by Arnold's story. Others were still unsure. The narrative had shifted, and Barron felt it, but he wasn't ready to let it go. He sat up straighter, fixed his cuffs, and with the faintest smirk returned to the microphone. "That's a powerful story, Mr. Schwarzenegger," he began, "truly. And I mean that, but I have to ask, at what point does a powerful story become a shield from scrutiny?" The room exhaled, the mood tightened, because while I respect everything you went through, and I genuinely do, it doesn't erase the reality of your public record. And it certainly doesn't grant you lifetime moral authority. He turned to the crowd, his voice growing more assertive. "You talk about rebuilding yourself through pain, but what about rebuilding California? The deficit returned after your reforms. Crime statistics were inconsistent. Some say your environmental initiatives were more symbolic than substantial." He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "And let's not pretend that your rise to power wasn't built, in part, on the very thing you claim to reject, celebrity." Now it was personal. The words hung in the air like barbed wire. "You didn't walk into politics from the streets. You walked in from a movie set." A few students gasped quietly, not because they didn't expect sharp words, but because this one landed deeper. "I'm not here to attack your story. I'm here to challenge the assumption that a dramatic past automatically means wise leadership. Because pain, Mr. Schwarzenegger, does not equal principle." Arnold didn't respond, not yet, but he blinked slowly. And that's when Barron went further, too far. "Let's talk about honesty," he said. "You speak of struggle and rebuilding, but there was a point where you rebuilt a lie. For years, you hid a second family. You had a child in secret. And when the truth came out, your own marriage collapsed. You talk about discipline, but where was that discipline when your choices hurt the people closest to you?" The air in the hall dropped 10 degrees. Even the moderator looked stunned. Some students turned their heads. Others stopped recording, not because they were bored, but because they weren't sure if they wanted to be part of what had just happened. Arnold didn't flinch, but he didn't move either. He sat still, breathing slowly, as if absorbing the weight of a blow that wasn't physical, but deeply personal. Barron, satisfied with the silence, sat back. For a moment, it looked like he had taken control again. And then Arnold reached down beside his chair and quietly pulled out a small black device. It looked like nothing special, just a pocket-sized recorder, no theatrics, no announcement. He held it in his palm like a reminder. The audience noticed immediately. Phones went back up. The silence grew even heavier. Arnold looked at the moderator. "I wasn't planning to use this tonight," he said softly. "I had hoped this conversation would be about the future, about ideas, but since we've decided to make this personal, about character, about truth, then perhaps the audience deserves to hear all of it." He turned to Barron, "Including your version of the truth." Barron's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" he asked, but the confidence had slipped, just slightly, not gone, but cracked. Arnold didn't answer. Instead, he placed the device on the table. 3 weeks ago, a student journalist from this very university interviewed you for a piece on young political voices. You didn't know it was still recording when the interview ended. A low murmur spread through the crowd like distant thunder. Arnold's tone remained calm, almost too calm. "What you said then doesn't match what you're saying now. And I believe this audience deserves to know which version is real." Barron's voice rose slightly. "That's a private recording. It wasn't authorized." Arnold nodded slowly. "Neither was the attack you just made on my family. But I let it go because I've learned that some things don't need to be defended. They just need to be seen in context." He tapped the play button. A voice came through the speakers. Barron's voice, clear, crisp, unmistakable. The room went still again. Arnold didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat back in his chair and let the truth do what it always does when handled correctly. It filled the room. Barron's voice played through the speakers, steady at first, casual, the kind of voice someone uses when they think no one's listening. "Honestly," he said, "I don't believe half the stuff I say in these debates. It's all part of the act. You give them the constitutional law jargon, the buzzwords, and they eat it up." The room didn't breathe. Phones froze midair. The students who had idolized Barron for his intellect, his presence, his promise, were suddenly sitting in the middle of a confession. And it was just getting started. The second voice on the recording was unfamiliar to most, but the tone marked it as a student, a peer. "So you don't really believe the things you're saying about Schwarzenegger?" they asked. Barron laughed. A soft, dismissive laugh. Look, I actually respect the guy. The immigrant story, the whole American dream stuff, it's impressive, but let's be real. My crowd doesn't want to hear that. They want me to say he's outdated, symbolic, irrelevant, so I give them what plays. He paused on the recording. The whole Hollywood doesn't make leaders line. I wrote that 2 nights ago. I knew it would land. A gasp ran through the audience, barely audible but electric. Barron didn't just plan the insult, he designed it, engineered it. And now it lay exposed on speakers, echoing across the debate hall like a bad decision come home. Arnold didn't move, he didn't need to. The room was moving for him now. The recording continued. I mean, if you look at his record, it's not terrible. The guy actually tried to balance the budget, did some environmental stuff, started programs for kids, but that's not what sells in conservative circles anymore. What sells is contrast, so I give them contrast. The student's voice came again. So the attacks on his past, the stuff about his family. Barron's voice lowered. Calculated. He had the affair, the kid, the scandal. It's public knowledge. You throw that in and suddenly you own the moral high ground. Doesn't matter if I mean it. It's politics. By now the mood in the hall had shifted completely. What began as a sparring match had become something else. Not a debate, a dissection. Of a persona, of a strategy, of a brand. The final blow came with almost no emotion at all. Politics isn't about truth, Barron said on the recording. It's about narrative. And if I have to call a guy like Schwarzenegger unfit to build mine, then that's just part of the game. The tape stopped. Silence followed. Heavy, profound. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because the lie had been too clean, too practiced, too convincing until now. Arnold finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes never leaving Barron's. So now we've heard it, he said quietly. Your real thoughts, not the version you gave these students, not the brand, the truth. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The disappointment in it was louder than any insult. Barron didn't respond. His jaw was tight, his hands fidgeting just beneath the table, fingers tapping without rhythm. For the first time since the debate began, he looked young, not like a rising political force, but like a boy caught in the middle of his own illusion. Arnold turned to the audience. You heard him say he respects the work, that he agrees with parts of it, that he thinks building contrast matters more than being honest, that you are not citizens but targets, that this, he gestured to the room, is not a conversation but a performance. He looked around, locking eyes with students who had come into the room as fans of Barron's. Is that leadership? No one answered. Arnold stood, not quickly, not for drama. He stood because it was time. I've made mistakes, big ones, personal ones, and they cost me, but I owned them, not because it was good PR, but because if you want to lead people, you start by being one of them. Flawed, human, honest. He faced Barron again. You want to win, I get that. I've wanted that too. But if you have to lie about who you are, about what you believe, if you have to tear down people you claim to admire just to stay relevant, then ask yourself what you're really building. Because when the applause fades and the headlines disappear, all that's left is the mirror. Barron opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Arnold didn't wait for a reply. He stepped back, placed the recorder gently on the moderator's table, and sat down. The applause didn't come immediately. It wasn't one of those dramatic eruptions. It began as a slow, uncertain ripple, a few students clapping, unsure if it was allowed, unsure if it was right. And then it grew. Row by row, second by second, until the entire hall was filled with it. Not loud, but lasting, a different kind of victory. Barron didn't move. His hands were still clasped in front of him, but the confidence that had defined him earlier was nowhere to be found. His gaze dropped for the first time, not just away from Arnold, but away from everyone. The applause faded slowly, replaced by the eerie hum of reality setting in, the kind of silence that comes after an illusion collapses. The moderator looked toward him, hesitant, unsure whether to continue or call the debate to a close. Barron finally spoke, but the words were dry, weightless. That was a private conversation, he muttered. His voice was thin, barely audible. I didn't give permission for that to be shared. Arnold didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tape had already spoken, not about legality, but about truth. The audience wasn't waiting for rebuttals. They were processing something more personal, disappointment. In the back row, a student slowly stood up. Sarah Chen, sophomore, political science major. She had introduced Barron at the last Young Republicans event, calling him the future of conservatism. Her phone was still in her hand, but she wasn't recording. She looked directly at Barron. "We believed in you," she said softly. "We thought you meant it." That was all, but it landed harder than any of Arnold's words. A few others nodded silently. Some closed their phones, some just looked down. Barron's eyes met hers for a second and then darted away. The walls of the debate hall, which once reflected his power, now echoed with a very different kind of energy. One he didn't control, one he couldn't talk over. The illusion of control had vanished. The moderator cleared her throat. "Given the circumstances, I think we'll conclude here," but she trailed off, unsure whether her voice would even matter now. The audience wasn't listening to her. They were watching Barron, watching someone who had just discovered how fast the stage can turn into a spotlight, and how that spotlight, when twisted by truth, can burn. He stood up slowly, gathering his notes with movements that looked rehearsed but no longer meant anything. Papers crinkled, hands shook slightly. His security detail hovered at the edge of the stage, waiting. He looked once more toward Arnold, who hadn't moved since sitting back down. Their eyes met again, but this time there was no challenge between them, only the unspoken acknowledgement of defeat. As Barron turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The C-SPAN feed caught it in full frame. On the large screen behind the stage, as the debate logo faded out, a technician had accidentally left up a slide, an earlier still of Barron from his campaign reel, where he was smiling, hand raised confidently at a past event. But now, juxtaposed with his pale, wordless exit, the image became a haunting contrast. The student next to the control booth quickly switched it off, but not before dozens of phones captured the moment. Barron walked off the stage without a word. No waves, no handshakes, just footsteps and silence. Outside the hall, press had already gathered. They had seen the live feed, microphones pointed toward the exit. But when Barron emerged, flanked by campus security, he kept his head down. One reporter shouted, "Do you stand by what you said in the recording?" He didn't respond. Another tried, "Is this the end of your political future?" Still nothing. Then finally, a voice asked, "What would your father say about this?" Barron froze for half a second, then continued walking. That question would follow him longer than any headline. Inside the debate hall, the students stayed seated longer than expected, not out of courtesy, but shock. Quiet conversations sparked in corners. No one was arguing anymore. They were reflecting, rewriting what they thought they knew. Arnold stood slowly, collected his small recorder, and turned to leave. No media scrum awaited him, no grand victory speech, just nods from a few students, a slow, quiet line of respect. As he passed Sarah Chen, she whispered, "Thank you." He simply nodded back. Outside, the cameras didn't chase him. They had enough footage for the night. Arnold walked calmly toward the street, not escorted, not surrounded. Just a man walking away after showing the difference between power and principle. The next morning, Georgetown was no longer just a university campus. It was the epicenter of a political earthquake. The clip of the debate, specifically the moment Arnold pressed play on the recording, had been shared over 200,000 times by sunrise. By noon, it was on every major network, dissected by pundits, analyzed by political strategists, and replayed by students who had once idolized Barron Trump. The hashtag #TruthTape was trending across platforms, and the consensus, even among many of his own supporters, was swift and brutal. The prodigy had cracked. Barron's carefully curated persona, the confident air, the intellectual firebrand, the principled conservative, was now a pile of carefully chosen words stripped bare by his own voice. Students began withdrawing from the Young Republicans Club in droves. By week's end, over 60% of its membership had either deactivated or issued public statements distancing themselves. Sarah Chen, the sophomore who had spoken during the debate, wrote a letter to the campus newspaper titled, "What We Thought We Knew." It ended with one line that echoed across social media. "Leadership built on performance is only powerful until the mask slips." Meanwhile, Arnold stayed quiet. He gave no interviews, posted nothing, and issued no statements. Reporters camped outside his hotel. They waited for a victory lap, a follow-up strike, a moment of triumph. But Arnold wasn't interested in that. He had never been. For him, the power of that night wasn't about applause or headlines. It was about holding a mirror to a system that had mistaken performance for principle. On the third day, a short video surfaced on Arnold's personal YouTube channel. It was filmed in a simple room. No graphics, no music, just him sitting at a plain wooden table. "A lot of people are asking why I didn't say more after the debate," he began. "Why I didn't issue a statement or celebrate. But the truth is, I didn't come here to win. I came to remind." He paused for a moment, then continued. "Remind people that leadership isn't about volume. It's not about applause. It's not about saying whatever gets you elected. It's about doing the hard thing when no one is looking. It's about keeping your word even when no one is checking. And most of all, it's about telling the truth, especially when it costs you." The video was under 4 minutes, but it was shared by veterans, by educators, by students across the country. In a time when people had grown numb to noise, Arnold had offered something quiet, and it cut deeper. Back at Georgetown, professors began using the debate as a case study in ethics and political communication. One professor remarked, "It wasn't just a takedown. It was a live demonstration of why authenticity matters." Schwarzenegger didn't shout, he didn't spin, he just told the truth. And when the moment came, he let someone's own words reveal the rest. Months passed. Barron quietly withdrew from public forums. His spring seminar on conservative philosophy was cancelled due to lack of interest. He stopped attending club meetings, avoided interviews, and disappeared from panels. Some said he'd gone back into strategy mode. Others said he was rethinking everything. Whatever the case, the certainty that had once defined him had vanished. Arnold, meanwhile, returned to his quiet activism. He reopened 2 youth centers in underserved neighborhoods, attended climate summits, and continued his work with after-school programs. When asked about the debate in a rare interview months later, he smiled and said, "It was never about me. It was about a principle that's bigger than politics. People can spot the difference between a performance and a purpose. And when they do, they remember it." In that same interview, he was asked whether he thought Barron could recover. Arnold paused, then answered carefully, "Everyone deserves a second chance, but only if they build it on truth. I've had to rebuild my life too, and it only works when you stop acting and start being." The interviewer asked him one final question. "If you could say one sentence to every young person in America watching that debate, what would it be?" Arnold didn't hesitate. "Be honest when it's hardest, that's when it counts." 2 years later, students still talk about that night, not because of the scandal, not because of the tape, but because they saw a moment where truth wasn't just spoken, it was lived. In the years that followed, clips from that debate would be used in classrooms, in campaign workshops, in leadership seminars, not as entertainment, but as a reminder of what integrity sounds like. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the internet, that 4-minute video still circulates. Just Arnold, sitting at a wooden table, reminding the world that strength isn't volume, that redemption isn't branding, and that the loudest moment in a room isn't always the one with the most words. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is silence after truth. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.